Step away from the boarding gate. People like you don't get priority boarding. The words rang across gate C-18 with the kind of confidence that only comes from someone convinced they would never be questioned. Conversations faded. Rolling suitcases slowed. Dozens of travelers turned at once, their attention settling on a black woman standing quietly with a boarding pass in one hand and a worn charcoal backpack resting on her shoulder. Naomi Brooks didn't flinch. She simply looked at the gate agent, her expression calm enough to make the silence around them feel louder than the accusation itself. She wore dark blue jeans, clean white sneakers, and a plain black t-shirt beneath a lightweight gray jacket. No designer logo. No expensive luggage. No jewelry announcing wealth. She looked like someone catching an ordinary flight after an ordinary workday. That was exactly the point. There's an issue with your reservation, the gate agent continued, extending a hand. Give me your boarding pass. Naomi handed it over without protest. The young man scanned it once, frowned dramatically, then scanned it again before shaking his head. You'll need to wait over there until we sort this out. A businessman standing nearby laughed softly enough for his companions to hear, but loudly enough for Naomi to notice. Guess somebody thought they could sneak into first class. Another passenger smiled without saying a word. Others simply watched. Airports had a way of turning strangers into spectators whenever tension appeared. Naomi quietly stepped aside exactly where she had been instructed. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply observed. Her eyes drifted across every detail inside the boarding area. The digital departure screen, the security cameras above the ceiling panels, the names stitched neatly onto employee uniforms, the supervisor speaking with another agent near the boarding bridge. She noticed everything. Years earlier, she had learned that people often revealed far more when they believed the other person had already lost. The boarding line continued moving. Families carrying backpacks were welcomed with warm smiles. Elderly couples were greeted by name. Frequent flyers received cheerful thanks for their loyalty. Then each smiling employee glanced toward Naomi before quickly looking away, as though her presence had become an inconvenience nobody wanted to acknowledge. A woman standing beside her whispered, "Did they tell you what happened?" Naomi offered a small smile. "Not yet. That doesn't seem right." Naomi nodded politely, but said nothing else. Her silence wasn't uncertainty. It was discipline. The gate's supervisor finally approached, tablet in hand, wearing the practiced expression of someone already convinced the decision had been made. "Ma'am, we're investigating your booking. Until then, you won't be boarding this aircraft." "May I ask why?" Naomi's voice remained steady, measured, almost gentle. "The system requires additional verification." "Has the system explained what needs verification?" The supervisor paused for half a second before answering. "That information isn't available." The answer floated through the gate like an unfinished sentence. Several passengers exchanged puzzled looks. Even the woman beside Naomi frowned. If there was truly a system problem, why couldn't anyone explain it? Naomi looked once toward the aircraft waiting beyond the glass. The afternoon sun reflected across its polished fuselage, while baggage crews worked below with practiced precision. Everything outside moved exactly on schedule. Only one thing had stopped. Her. The supervisor folded his arms. "I suggest you remain cooperative." Naomi met his eyes without the slightest trace of anger. "I always do." He mistook her composure for surrender. So did everyone else watching from gate C-18. None of them realized the boarding gate had already become something much larger than an airport checkpoint. Without a single raised voice, it had quietly transformed into a courtroom where every word, every decision, and every assumption was about to become evidence. Naomi remained exactly where she had been told to stand while the boarding line continued shrinking with mechanical efficiency. Families disappeared down the jet bridge. Business travelers checked their watches. Flight attendants smiled as passengers stepped onto the aircraft, unaware that the real disruption was no longer a delayed traveler, but the quiet test unfolding only a few yards away. Naomi shifted the strap of her backpack slightly higher onto her shoulder and glanced toward the large windows overlooking the runway. She had flown hundreds of times during the past 2 decades, yet this trip was unlike any before it. She had deliberately booked the flight under her real name. She had declined the company aircraft waiting less than 10 miles away. She had instructed her executive assistant not to notify anyone at the airline. No airport escorts. No executive services. No priority greeting. She wanted one simple thing: to experience the airline exactly as an ordinary passenger would. That decision had been made 3 weeks earlier after reading dozens of customer complaints describing travelers who believed they had been judged before anyone even looked at their tickets. Some stories mentioned clothing. Others mentioned race. Others simply described the unmistakable feeling that someone had already decided they did not belong. Reports could be edited. Surveys could be manipulated. Meetings could hide uncomfortable truths behind polished presentations. Real life rarely did. A young father standing nearby adjusted the backpack on his little daughter before quietly asking the supervisor whether everything was all right. The supervisor answered with a rehearsed smile. "We are handling a reservation issue." The father looked toward Naomi. She returned a polite nod that carried neither embarrassment nor frustration. He seemed unconvinced by the explanation, but continued boarding with his daughter after one last uncertain glance. Naomi noticed something else. Not a single employee had attempted to verify anything with her directly. They had spoken around her instead of to her. Every answer remained vague. Every explanation floated behind words like policy, procedure, and verification. It was remarkable how often uncertainty borrowed the language of confidence. Her phone vibrated once inside her jacket pocket. She glanced at the screen without unlocking it. A scheduled reminder appeared exactly on time. She dismissed it with one touch and slipped the phone away. There would be a moment to make calls later. This was not that moment. Truth had a way of revealing itself more completely when left uninterrupted. 2 gate agents gathered several feet away, believing their lowered voices protected the conversation. "She does not look like a premium passenger," one whispered. "Maybe somebody booked the wrong ticket." The other shrugged. "Whatever it is, the supervisor will deal with it." Naomi heard every word without changing expression. Assumptions often arrived long before facts, and once they settled into a room, they became surprisingly difficult to remove. An elderly woman seated near the charging station watched the exchange with growing concern. Finally, she stood, walked toward Naomi, and spoke softly. "Excuse me. I hope you do not mind me asking, but have they actually told you what is wrong?" Naomi offered the same composed smile she had carried since the first accusation. "No, ma'am. Not yet." The woman frowned. "That is not how people should be treated." Naomi thanked her quietly. Kindness from strangers was never loud. It rarely demanded attention. Yet in moments like this, it carried more weight than authority ever could. Across the gate area, the supervisor returned with a tighter expression than before, a tablet tucked beneath one arm, and another employee following close behind. Neither smiled this time. Whatever happened next would not be an accident. It would be a choice. And choices, Naomi knew better than anyone, always left a record whether people realized it or not. The supervisor stopped a few feet in front of Naomi and folded his hands around the tablet as though it carried unquestionable authority. Behind him stood another gate agent wearing a name badge that read Daniel Mercer, his expression cautious but noticeably less certain than everyone else around him. The supervisor cleared his throat before speaking loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "We still cannot clear you for boarding." Naomi met his eyes. "Can you explain why?" "Your reservation requires additional review." "Additional review? By whom?" The supervisor hesitated for only a heartbeat before replying. "That information is internal." The answer settled over the waiting area like heavy fog. It sounded official without actually saying anything. Naomi nodded once. "Then perhaps someone with access to that information should speak with me." Instead of answering, the supervisor reached out his hand. "I also need your identification." Naomi handed over her driver's license without complaint. He examined it for several seconds, then looked from the photograph to her face and back again. "Please remain here." He walked away carrying both her identification and boarding pass. Several travelers exchanged uncomfortable glances. One middle-aged man quietly muttered, "That seems excessive." His wife squeezed his arm as if encouraging him not to become involved. Airports were full of witnesses who preferred schedules over confrontation. Daniel remained behind, shifting his weight uneasily. He looked toward Naomi before lowering his voice. "I am sure this will be resolved." Naomi smiled politely. "I hope so." A few moments later, another employee approached carrying a handheld scanner. Without greeting Naomi, she scanned the boarding pass again, frowned dramatically, and whispered something to the supervisor. He nodded immediately. Neither of them attempted to show Naomi the screen. Neither explained what they supposedly found. Procedure had quietly become performance. Across the waiting area, boarding continued uninterrupted. First-class passengers disappeared down the jet bridge while Naomi remained standing only a few yards away, watching time move forward without her. The aircraft was ready. The crew was ready. The passengers were almost ready. Only one traveler had somehow become a problem no one could clearly describe. Then the supervisor spoke again, this time with unmistakable firmness. Airport security has been asked to stop by until we complete verification. A ripple moved through the surrounding crowd. Several people looked up from their phones. The elderly woman who had spoken with Naomi earlier frowned openly. Security? For what? She asked. The supervisor offered a tight smile. Standard procedure. Naomi remained completely composed. Have I violated any policy? Not at this time. Have I been disruptive? No. Then why involve security? The supervisor looked away instead of answering. Silence often revealed more than words. Two uniformed airport security officers appeared at the far end of the gate area, walking with calm professionalism rather than urgency. Their arrival alone changed the atmosphere. Passengers instinctively stepped aside, creating space that had not existed moments earlier. Naomi noticed the reaction more than the officers themselves. Fear often spread faster than facts. Daniel quietly glanced toward the approaching officers before looking back at Naomi. His expression suggested he wanted to say something, but could not find the courage. Nearby, another gate agent leaned toward a coworker and whispered words Naomi heard with perfect clarity. People like her always argue when they get caught. The sentence was short, almost casual, yet it landed harder than every vague explanation offered so far. Naomi slowly turned toward the speaker. She did not challenge him. She did not raise her voice. She simply held his gaze long enough for him to realize she had heard every word. He looked away first. Around them, the boarding gate no longer felt like the entrance to a flight. It felt like a place where assumptions had quietly replaced evidence, and every passing minute was adding another layer to a story the airline would soon have to explain. The two airport security officers stopped several feet from Naomi instead of surrounding her. Their calm expressions stood in sharp contrast to the growing tension that had settled over the gate. One of them spoke first. Good afternoon, ma'am. We were asked to remain nearby while the boarding team completes a verification. Naomi acknowledged him with a respectful nod. Have I been accused of violating any law or airport regulation? The officer glanced toward the supervisor before answering. No, ma'am. Have I refused any instruction? No. Then I appreciate you treating me with professionalism. The officer nodded quietly, and for the first time since the confrontation began, someone had answered her questions with clear words instead of rehearsed phrases. Nearby passengers noticed the exchange immediately. The atmosphere shifted ever so slightly. If security was not treating Naomi like a threat, why had everyone else acted as though she was one? Daniel Mercer stood frozen behind the boarding podium, watching the conversation unfold. He looked from Naomi to the supervisor and then toward the departure monitor overhead. Boarding was nearly complete, yet the flight remained open because one unresolved passenger still stood in front of the gate. His eyes drifted back to the reservation screen on the tablet lying beside him. Something continued bothering him. Earlier that morning, while reviewing the premium passenger list before boarding began, he was almost certain he had seen the name Naomi Brooks marked with an unusual executive notation. He had dismissed it at the time because the supervisor quickly took control of the manifest. Now the memory refused to disappear. Daniel quietly reached for the tablet again. The supervisor noticed immediately. Leave that alone, he said without looking up. I just wanted to confirm something, Daniel replied carefully. There is nothing to confirm. The firmness in the supervisor's voice attracted even more attention from nearby travelers. An elderly woman who had remained seated throughout the incident slowly stood and addressed the supervisor directly. Young man, if there really is a reservation problem, why does nobody explain it to her? No answer came. Instead, the supervisor pretended to review paperwork that had already been checked several times. Silence was beginning to look less like procedure and more like avoidance. Across the waiting area, a college student wearing headphones lowered his backpack and quietly raised his phone. Before he could begin recording, Naomi noticed the movement. Please, she said gently, do not record this. The student looked surprised. People should see what is happening. Naomi smiled with remarkable composure. I would rather they hear the truth than watch another argument without context. He slowly lowered his phone. I understand. Her response spread through the crowd almost as quickly as any video could have. She was not trying to embarrass anyone. She simply wanted answers. That realization changed the mood around Gate C18. The elderly woman stepped closer to Naomi. I believe you deserve better than this, she said softly. A businessman who had remained silent until now nodded in agreement. So do I. Daniel took a slow breath and looked once more at the reservation system. Against his supervisor's instruction, he quietly opened the passenger details. His eyes widened for the briefest moment before he quickly minimized the screen again. Whatever he had just seen erased every trace of confidence from his face. He looked toward Naomi, then back toward the supervisor, struggling with a choice that suddenly felt much larger than company policy. The boarding gate had reached a turning point. It no longer mattered how many people believed the supervisor. What mattered was whether even one person inside the system was willing to tell the truth before the truth arrived on its own. Daniel's hands remained motionless above the tablet, but his mind was racing. The executive notation had not disappeared. It had never been missing at all. Someone had simply chosen not to acknowledge it. He looked toward his supervisor, then toward Naomi, whose patience seemed almost impossible to understand. Most passengers would have argued by now. Many would have demanded a manager, threatened complaints, or abandoned the flight altogether. Naomi did none of those things. She simply stood with quiet dignity while the weight of every assumption settled around her. The supervisor noticed Daniel's hesitation and stepped closer. Close the passenger record, he ordered. We have already made our decision. Daniel swallowed. But I think there is information we should review. I said close it. The words landed harder than necessary. Several nearby passengers heard the exchange, and the uneasy silence returned. Naomi watched without interruption. She had spent years leading boardrooms where fear often disguised itself as confidence. This felt painfully familiar. Decisions made first. Evidence searched for later. The supervisor turned back toward Naomi with a practiced smile that no longer convinced anyone. Ma'am, the aircraft will be departing shortly. If this verification is not completed, you will need to be rebooked on another flight. Naomi tilted her head slightly. What exactly is being verified? Your eligibility to travel under this reservation. Based on what information? Internal policy. Can you identify the policy? He could not. Instead, he looked toward the security officers as though hoping their presence would end the conversation for him. Neither officer moved. They had seen nothing requiring intervention. The elderly woman folded her arms. He keeps answering questions without answering them. A businessman standing beside her nodded. That is because there are no answers. Those words drifted through the boarding area with surprising force. The confidence behind the supervisor's posture began to fade. Naomi's thoughts wandered for only a moment, carried backward nearly 20 years. She remembered standing inside another airport after finishing a consulting project that had taken months to secure. She had been dressed professionally, carrying nothing more than a briefcase and a confirmed first-class ticket. A gate employee had looked at her, looked at the boarding pass, and quietly asked whether she was certain she belonged in the correct boarding lane. The question had sounded polite, but the meaning behind it had stayed with her long after the flight landed. That afternoon she promised herself that if she ever gained enough influence to change a culture instead of merely surviving it, she would. The memory disappeared as quickly as it arrived. Naomi returned her attention to the present. Different airport, different faces, the same invisible test. Daniel looked once more at the reservation record. This time he noticed another field hidden beneath the passenger profile. His heartbeat quickened. The account carried an executive authorization code that ordinary reservations never received. Before he could study it further, the supervisor reached over and lowered the tablet screen. Enough, he said sharply. You are creating confusion, Daniel quietly replied. Maybe the confusion started before I opened the file. The sentence hung in the air. Even the security officers exchanged brief glances. Naomi looked toward Daniel with calm appreciation, but offered no encouragement. He had to make his own decision. Truth carried value only when it was chosen freely. The boarding door remained open even though every scheduled passenger except one had already checked in. The aircraft waited. The crew waited. The gate agents waited. What none of them realized was that every additional minute was preserving another piece of evidence. Naomi had not come to win an argument. She had come to discover whether integrity still existed inside a system that claimed to value every traveler equally. In only a few more moments, that question would begin answering itself. The supervisor checked his watch, then looked toward the aircraft with visible impatience. Every passing minute increased pressure on the departure schedule, yet he seemed more determined to defend his earlier decision than to discover whether it had been correct. "This discussion is over," he announced. "If verification is not completed immediately, you will not be traveling today." Naomi's expression never changed. "Then I believe we have reached the point where someone else should continue this conversation." She reached into the pocket of her jacket and removed her phone with the same calm movement she had used since the first accusation. No dramatic gesture, no visible frustration, just quiet certainty. She unlocked the screen, selected a single contact, and placed the call. The line connected before the second ring. "Good afternoon, Ms. Brooks," a composed female voice answered. "This is Evelyn." Naomi spoke as though she were confirming an ordinary meeting. "Please activate Protocol 7. There was no hesitation on the other end. "Confirmed. Executive Response Protocol 7 is now active. Do you require legal participation?" "Yes." "Corporate compliance?" "Yes." "Operational audit?" "Immediately." A brief pause followed as keyboard clicks echoed faintly through the speaker. "The response team has been notified. Executive leadership is joining the secure conference now. Please remain where you are." Naomi thanked her softly and ended the call. That was all. No threats. No raised voice. No announcement about titles or authority. Just a conversation lasting less than 30 seconds. The supervisor smirked. "Calling customer service will not change the boarding process." Naomi looked at him with quiet patience. "I did not call customer service." Daniel felt a chill run through him. Whatever executive notation he had seen on the reservation suddenly made perfect sense. He looked down at the tablet once again. New alerts had already begun appearing across the internal system. The reservation file refreshed automatically. Then another notification appeared. Then another. He had never seen multiple executive priority alerts arrive simultaneously on a single passenger profile. His breathing slowed as realization settled over him. Across the gate area, the security officers both received notifications on their department devices. One glanced at the screen, frowned slightly, and looked back toward Naomi with noticeably greater attention than before. Nearby passengers sensed that something invisible had shifted. The atmosphere itself seemed different. Not louder, not calmer, simply heavier, as though the airport had paused to listen. The elderly woman leaned toward the businessman beside her. "That was not an ordinary phone call." He quietly replied, "No, I do not think it was." The supervisor attempted to dismiss the growing uncertainty by returning to the boarding podium. "Close the aircraft door preparation," he instructed another employee. Before she could respond, her computer chimed with a priority notification. She stared at the monitor for several long seconds without speaking. "Is something wrong?" the supervisor asked. She swallowed. "The departure file has been placed under executive review." "By whom?" "It does not say." Daniel's own tablet vibrated again. This time the notification appeared in bold lettering across the top of the screen. "Preserve all gate activity. Do not alter passenger records. Await executive instructions." He looked up slowly. Those were not messages issued for routine reservation problems. They were directives used only when senior leadership required a complete operational review. Naomi slipped her phone back into her pocket and quietly resumed waiting exactly where she had stood from the beginning. She had not moved closer to the aircraft. She had not attempted to leave. She simply allowed the system to respond to the truth it had finally been forced to recognize. Around gate C-18, confidence began changing sides. The people who had spent the last several minutes demanding explanations suddenly found themselves searching for answers of their own. The boarding gate had stopped feeling like a place where one passenger was being questioned. It had become a place where every decision made by the airline was about to be examined with the same scrutiny they had once directed toward Naomi Brooks. The first ringtone shattered the supervisor's confidence long before anyone answered. He glanced at the company phone clipped to his belt, frowned at the caller identification, and quickly stepped a few feet away before accepting the call. "Yes," he said with forced confidence. The color drained from his face almost immediately. No, she is still here. A pause. Yes, we were following procedure. Another pause, much longer this time. His shoulders stiffened. I understand. He lowered the phone slowly without saying another word. Around him, every employee noticed the change. Confidence had disappeared from his posture, replaced by uncertainty he could no longer hide. Before anyone could ask what happened, Daniel's tablet chimed again. This notification appeared with a bright red executive banner stretching across the entire screen. Executive Operations Response Team arriving on site. Preserve all records. Suspend discretionary decisions. He stared at the message in disbelief. The same alert appeared on the workstation beside him. Another gate agent looked down at her monitor and whispered, "I have never seen this before." Neither had Daniel. The airport security officers received another update on their devices. One of them quietly stepped closer to Naomi, not to restrict her movement, but to ensure she remained comfortable while everyone else seemed to lose theirs. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "if you need anything. While we wait, please let us know." Naomi thanked him with the same calm grace she had shown from the beginning. Nothing about her expression suggested victory. She simply waited. The elderly woman smiled softly. Funny how respect finally arrives when people start asking the right questions. A businessman standing nearby nodded. Or when the right people start asking them. The supervisor finally walked back toward Naomi, though the authority in his stride had vanished. "May I ask who you called?" Naomi answered without hesitation. "Someone responsible for making sure this airline lives up to the standards it promises every passenger." He swallowed hard. "Could you be more specific?" Naomi looked directly into his eyes. "A few minutes ago you decided I did not belong at this gate. You questioned my reservation without evidence. You delayed my travel without explanation. You involved security without identifying a single policy I violated. Now you are asking who I am." She paused just long enough for every nearby traveler to hear the silence surrounding her words. The better question is why none of those answers mattered until after I made one phone call. No one spoke. Even the boarding announcements from neighboring gates seemed distant. Naomi continued, her voice measured and unmistakably steady. "You stopped me at the boarding gate of an airline my investment group now controls through its largest institutional ownership position. I was never testing whether I could board this aircraft. I was testing whether an ordinary passenger would receive fairness before anyone recognized influence." Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment. Everything suddenly aligned. The executive notation, the priority alerts, the preservation order. It had all been pointing toward this single truth. The supervisor stepped backward as though the floor itself had shifted beneath him. "You are Ms. Brooks?" Naomi nodded once. "Yes." His mouth opened, but no explanation came. Across the gate area, phones began vibrating almost simultaneously as managers received emergency instructions. The employee workstation locked for several seconds before reopening under restricted access. The departure status changed from boarding to executive hold. The atmosphere transformed completely. Only minutes earlier, Naomi had been treated like someone whose presence needed justification. Now every person wearing an airline badge understood the painful reality. The greatest mistake had never been questioning her identity. It had been the way they treated someone they believed had none. No one moved for several long seconds. The boarding gate, once filled with hurried footsteps and routine announcements, had become almost impossibly still. The supervisor stared at Naomi as though he were trying to rewrite the last 20 minutes in his mind, searching for a version where he had asked one more question instead of making one more assumption. His company phone rang again. This time he answered immediately. "Yes." He listened in silence. "Understood." His shoulders dropped. "I will comply." The call ended without another word. At nearly the same moment, every airline workstation at Gate C-18 displayed the same executive directive. Preserve all surveillance footage. Lock all passenger records. Suspend all discretionary authority. Await executive operations. Daniel watched the supervisor attempt to access the boarding controls again. An error message appeared instead. Access temporarily restricted. The boarding scanner no longer accepted his credentials. Another gate agent tried logging into her workstation. The same message appeared. Around them, quiet confusion spread through the airline staff. The authority they had exercised only moments earlier had quietly disappeared, replaced by instructions arriving from people none of them could overrule. Less than 3 minutes later, four professionally dressed executives walked through the concourse with purposeful but unhurried steps. Their identification badges carried corporate executive credentials rather than airport operations titles. Travelers instinctively stepped aside without being asked. The group did not stop at the boarding podium. They did not greet the supervisor first. They walked directly toward Naomi. The woman leading the team smiled respectfully. "Good afternoon, Ms. Brooks. I am Evelyn Carter, Executive Vice President of Corporate Operations. I apologize that we were not here before this happened." Naomi returned the greeting with the same composure she had shown everyone else. "Thank you for coming." Evelyn nodded once before turning toward the gathered airline employees. "From this moment forward, no one is to modify reservation records, delete system activity, or continue boarding procedures until our review is complete." Her voice remained calm, but every instruction carried unmistakable authority. Daniel stepped forward carefully. "I would like to report that I observed executive notation on Ms. Brooks's reservation before boarding began." Evelyn looked directly at him. "Thank you for speaking up. Please remain available for the review team." Daniel quietly exhaled. The decision to tell the truth had suddenly become the easiest one he had made all day. The supervisor lowered his eyes. "I believed I was following policy." Evelyn answered without raising her voice. "Policy requires verification. It does not permit assumptions. Policy protects passengers. It does not replace judgment." Those words echoed through the waiting area with more force than any argument could have. The elderly woman smiled gently at Naomi. "I knew something felt wrong." Naomi nodded. "Sometimes people recognize fairness long before systems do." The two security officers remained nearby, though their role had completely changed. They were no longer present because of Naomi. They were there to preserve the integrity of the review. One officer politely asked nearby travelers to leave the area undisturbed while corporate staff documented the sequence of events. Several passengers quietly thanked Naomi as they passed. Others simply offered respectful nods. No applause broke out. No dramatic celebration followed. The silence itself carried enough weight. It was the silence of people recognizing that dignity should never depend upon a title, expensive clothing, or executive influence. Evelyn handed Naomi her boarding pass and driver's license with both hands. "Everything has been verified." It always was. Naomi accepted them with a grateful smile. "I know." She looked once across the boarding gate where every face reflected a different lesson. Some carried relief. Others carried regret. All of them now understood that the greatest failure had not been a reservation mistake. It had been forgetting that every passenger deserved the same measure of respect before anyone knew who they were. Naomi accepted her boarding pass, slipped it carefully into her jacket pocket, and adjusted the strap of her backpack exactly as she had done before any of this began. Nothing about her appearance had changed. The same jeans, the same sneakers, the same quiet confidence. Yet everyone at Gate C-18 looked at her differently now. The transformation had never belonged to Naomi. It belonged to the people around her. Evelyn turned toward the assembled managers and spoke with measured authority. "An immediate operational review has been initiated. Every decision made at this gate today will be examined through reservation records, surveillance footage, employee statements, and communication logs. The purpose is not simply accountability. The purpose is to ensure that this never becomes routine." No one argued. No one searched for excuses. The facts had already begun speaking louder than opinions ever could. Daniel stood silently for a moment before approaching Naomi. "I should have spoken sooner," he admitted. "I knew something did not feel right." Naomi smiled kindly. "The important part is that you chose integrity when it mattered most." He nodded with visible relief. The words were simple, yet they carried more encouragement than criticism ever could. The elderly woman gathered her handbag before preparing to board. As she passed Naomi, she paused long enough to say, "Thank you for standing your ground without losing your grace." Naomi answered softly, "Thank you for reminding everyone that kindness still exists." The woman smiled and continued toward the aircraft. One by one, the remaining passengers followed, many offering respectful nods as they passed. Some never said a word. They did not need to. Their expressions revealed everything. The security officers stepped aside, opening a clear path toward the boarding bridge. It was a small gesture, but everyone, noticed it. Respect no longer came from discovering who Naomi was. It came from recognizing who she had been all along. Before stepping onto the jet bridge, Naomi turned once more toward the supervisor. He stood quietly beside the podium, no longer attempting to defend what had happened. "I am sorry," he said sincerely. "I allowed assumptions to become decisions." Naomi looked at him for several seconds before answering. "The hardest mistakes to correct are the ones people do not realize they are making. Learn from today. Make certain the next passenger never has to teach this lesson again." He lowered his head with genuine understanding. Evelyn watched the exchange before quietly saying, "That is leadership." Naomi simply smiled. She walked down the jet bridge at an unhurried pace while the afternoon sunlight reflected through the windows beside her. Every step felt remarkably ordinary, and that was exactly how it should have been from the beginning. When she reached the aircraft door, the captain welcomed her personally and thanked her for her patience. Naomi returned the greeting politely before entering the cabin without expecting applause, recognition, or special treatment. She took her assigned seat, placed her backpack beneath the seat in front of her, and looked out the window as the boarding door finally closed. Beyond the glass, baggage crews continued their work, aircraft taxied across the runway, and the airport returned to its familiar rhythm. Life moved forward, but something meaningful had changed. Somewhere inside the airline, procedures would be reviewed, conversations would become training, and assumptions would become lessons rather than habits. Naomi closed her eyes for a brief moment before the safety announcement began. She had not raised her voice. She had not demanded privilege. She had simply refused to surrender her dignity. Real leadership was never about proving that one extraordinary person deserved respect. It was about building a world where no ordinary person ever had to earn it in the first place.